A Conversation on Consciousness with Professor Max Velmans. Professor Max Velmans is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths University of London, principally known for his theory of consciousness known as Reflexive Monism. Reflexive Monism bridges the materialist-dualist divide by noting that, in terms of their phenomenology, experiences of the external world are none other than the physical world as experienced, thereby placing aspects of human consciousness in the external phenomenal world. Professor Velmans has around 100 publications in the area of consciousness studies, including Understanding Consciousness and Towards a Deeper Understanding of Consciousness. His work has been categorized as non-reductionist in that he stresses the importance and complementary application of first and third person accounts.
All right, if you don't mind, I would love to start this off just by asking you to talk a little bit about your recent work or your most recent consciousness.
It's still coming across quite distorted, actually, from you. But let me go for it then. So I'm still very much involved in integrative work. So at the moment, I'm, if you like, tying all the detailed work I've done on consciousness, construed as phenomenal consciousness, in other words, thinking about it in a very conventional way, to mental processing, but also trying to embed that into a broader model of how consciousness and mind fit into our understanding of the physical world and so on. And I'm actually quite interested in the way that links with both Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy too. So it's a kind of extension of the work I've been doing for about the last 40 years, really. Looking at unusual phenomena as well as ordinary phenomena. So just about all of my work deals with conventional ways of thinking about consciousness, but thinking about those ways in a somewhat unconventional way, but completely defensible as far as I can see within mainstream science, philosophy, and so on, to looking at the edges of the way people experience unusual phenomena and so on. It's just a current interest. But I think that will take us too far afield. So there's the question I think you want to address within the mainstream work that is your focus and interest, that in some ways it might take us too far afield to get into that.
It might well take us a bit too far, but I am a little curious. Is there an example you could give of something unusual, something that is an edge case?
For example, how do you make sense of a mystical experience?
A mystical experience?
Yes, or a whole range of other phenomena where people are experiencing what they believe to be the experience of things that actually exist, but would be treated as pathological or hallucinatory by, shall we say, mainstream thought, and opening up the space within which some of that experience can be, in principle, taken seriously and maybe incorporated in a meaningful way into an expanded model of how we think about the relationship of consciousness to the brain and the physical world.
I see. All right. Well, maybe we should start at the very beginning. How would you define consciousness?
Yeah. I think, as you probably know, there are many different definitions of consciousness out there in the field. And in order to find, if you like, a point of a point of convergence for all those folk working from different disciplines in a way that allows the work to converge with each other. My own view is that it's important to keep things really simple right at the beginning. And so the point of departure that I use is what's commonly known in philosophy of mind as phenomenal consciousness. And phenomenal consciousness is easily understood, for example, in terms of being conscious of something versus not being conscious of that thing. So in terms of the things that exist, whether they be objects in the world or aspects of the mind or whatever you care to name, their existence may or may not be there, but and they may or may not influence you. But if you experience them in some way, they form part of your phenomenal consciousness. Mm-hmm. So that's, if you like, the first cut. You either experience something or you don't. And so there is a sense in which when you define any word, and that includes consciousness, the first thing you have to do is to, if you like, metaphorically point to it. You have to draw attention to something that you're trying to distinguish from everything else. And that's just step one. But step two then is trying to make sense of the thing that you're pointing to. So in this case, that would mean trying to make sense of phenomenal consciousness. And that would require you to then fit your what you're pointing to into a network of concepts. In the case of phenomenal consciousness, that would mean, for example, starting to examine the relationship between phenomenal consciousness and the brain and the physical world, starting to understand the relationship between events that have representation in phenomenal consciousness and don't. So that means understanding the conscious, non-conscious distinction. Trying to get a sense also of the senses in which phenomenal consciousness can represent autonomously existing events and so on, as opposed to simply having a psychological reality and no more than that. And ultimately, one has to fit all these distinctions and relationships into a framework of understanding. And as the framework of understanding deepens, as we start to learn more about it, we actually also, at the same time, learn more about what consciousness is. So in a way, the very meaning of, what is consciousness requires you to elaborate all those relationships. And in that sense, our understanding of consciousness flows a process which is no different to understanding any initially ill-defined term in science, for example. So, what is energy? And you kind of point to a phenomenon, and you only understand it once you've developed a network of relationships of, within your understanding deepens that sense of what it is that you're looking at or attending to.
So it sounds to me like this was already your description of what makes a good approach to or a good theory of consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
yeah, and I suppose the thing, what I would emphasize there is that it must be really important to start there before you develop your theory of consciousness. So what happens all too commonly in the field is that people start with, if you like, a theoretical position, and then redefine consciousness in terms of something that will fit in with their theoretical position. So that's very common in the field. So for example, let's take a very common popular theory of consciousness. You might say consciousness is just the workings of a global workspace in the brain.
Right.
But if you like, finesses the question of how does conscious phenomenology relate to the workings of the global workspace in the brain. And if you actually define it that way, you never get around to investigating how that phenomenology will actually relates to the workings of that global workspace, insofar as that theoretical construct actually turns out to have reality.
Is this a problem that not just global workspace theory, but also other theories like integrated information theory run into, that they start with an assumption about how things are, and then they try to find something that fits rather than starting with the phenomenology?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Your picture is darkening out suddenly, but can you hear me?
I can certainly hear you. I can hear you very well,
me?
actually. Yes, I can see you as well.
Okay. And I've got you back now. Okay. No, I would say that obviously all these theories are potentially very relevant, but the problem is let's take integrated information theory. If you redefine consciousness as in terms of your theory about the conditions for its emergence, then you've automatically redirected all your efforts to looking at the situations where those conditions obtain or don't obtain, and you extrapolate from that to say that in the situations where they don't obtain, let's say not in human beings now, consciousness can't obtain because you've defined it that way. But if you withhold judgment, if you like, right at the beginning, I would say that global information theory has obvious application to the way that consciousness is structured, and that's quite a separate matter to whether it exists. So, for example, if one doesn't prejudge that issue, you open up the possibility, for example, to a very broad form of panpsychism, where you might say that consciousness is basic, but in its very basic form, there's not a lot of information. And it could even be that in some basic way that in systems that at a high level do have integrated information, that some of their compositional bits and parts which don't have it integrated in that kind of way, you still have a very basic sort of consciousness, which is less complex. So basically what I'm saying is it's important to begin with anyway to differentiate complexity from existence. And so I'm always a little bit worried about taking a theoretical construct like that, translating the whole enterprise into an investigation of the applicability of that theoretical construct, and then going right back and saying, well, that's the way to stand nominal consciousness. Because, for example, you know all there was to know about integrated information in different systems, and still not know anything about the particular kind of qualia that associate the operation of that kind of integrated functioning. So that's a separate issue.
I found the same problem, that it's very difficult for me to use something like integrated information theory to try to understand why consciousness appears to me the way that it is, or why consciousness has certain characteristics. So very difficult to use it.
Yes, I completely agree with you about that.
Yeah. So your position, as you've said in email, is reflexive monism, and I'm assuming that because you put a high degree of value on phenomenology and on not sort of setting up a position in advance, but you came to it in another way. Would you like to tell me a little bit about reflexive monism?
You're breaking up, actually, but I think I got your question. Breaking up.
I hope so.
Sorry?
I hope you can still understand my question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've got the question. So you're asking how I got to reflexive monism? Yeah?
Yes.
Without presupposing anything.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so the starting place for reflexive monism was a simple observation about ordinary perception. So one of the implicit assumptions, which is still widespread in the field, and which applies to both the early dualism, say Descartes' dualism, and most of the reductive materialisms, which, are the contemporary, mainstream views, all the way from physicalism to functionalism, have an implicit assumption about ordinary perception, and the assumption really concerns the relationship between three things. In the case of visual perception, for example, one thinks of events or entities and objects in the world as physical things. And in the process of seeing those physical things, one assumes that light rays reflected from the surfaces of, say, these objects stimulate the visual system, which in turn produces activation in the occipital regions of the brain and so on. And then one has a consequent visual experience. So there's a linear process. And if you're a dualist, you have a question about the nature of those experiences. You say, well, we can't observe the experiences in the brain anywhere. They must be something else, somewhere else, or nowhere. And they have neither location nor extension, and they're an aspect of what Descartes called res cogitans, something like a substance that thinks, which is entirely non-physical. And then if you're a materialist, you say, well, that doesn't make any sense within science, so all that must reduce in some way to a state or function of the brain. But what those positions share is that the actual experience is either in the brain or in some way associated with the brain and separate from the object out there in the world and the visual system and so on. Yep. Now, the starting point for reflexive monism is to challenge that last step. So you're watching me, for example, on a screen, and I could ask you to attend to your experience with me on the screen. And it's a visual experience, and also you can hear a voice. And if I simply say, look, remain pre-theoretical for the moment, and just give me an accurate description of what it is that you experience, then if you're like me, you'll say, well, the only experience I'm having visually of you is this image I see on the screen. And the only auditory experience I have of you is this sound that seems to be coming from my computer out there in the world. And there isn't any other experience that you're having. And basically what's, let's say it's an object in, or even the computer itself that you're looking at, within what I call the reflexive model of perception, an object or an entity in the world, in this case your computer screen, has these light reflectances and so on, which stimulate your visual system and which in turn produces activity in the occipital regions of the brain, which in turn, interacts with other associated regions, which allow those initial analyses, cortical analyses, to become conscious. what we might call, the neural conditions for consciousness are formed, and then I have a consequent experience, but my consequent experience is seeing you out here on the screen, and same for you, you see me out there on your screen. So there is a kind of reflexive aspect to it. There's an event that starts in the world pre-consciously, me as another entity in the world engages with this, through my perceptual and cognitive processes. And as a result of that, those pre-conscious operations, I see you out in the world, on my computer screen, just as you see me out in the world on your computer screen. So the process kind of loops back on itself. Yeah. So that's the reflexive model of perception. Extending the story a little bit further, if you pinch your fingers together, for example, and you'll feel a tactile sensation at your fingertips. Yeah. And how come it's down there at the fingertips? It's actually a sensation. You've depressed the skin of the fingers. This has stimulated the sense organs, which have sent signals up to the sensory cortex. And as a result of stimulation in the sensory cortex, you experience a sensation, but it's back down there in the fingers, not in the cortex. Even if I directly stimulated the cortex with a microelectrode, I'd still get a feeling of numbness or tingling in the fingers. It would be in the cortex. And so there's something which I call label, a phenomenon which I'd label as perceptual projection taking place. And extending this idea now, you can say, well, the same basic process applies to the entire phenomenal world. So basically, we live in a kind of sea of energy and information, and we're particularly localized, if you like, and organized combinations of energy information, which make up our bodies and our sensory organs and our cognitive systems and so on. And everything else that's out there that's seen as an object is also a kind of localized organization of energy information and so on. And pre-consciously, we as perceiving agents interact with these external events and entities and so on to produce perceived version of those external entities and events, and the same for ourselves. So, we look down at our bodies and there seems to be something extending to the floor and so on. But that too is a construction. And now we're getting into reflexive monism, if you like. And reflexive monism says, look, there's a kind of underlying unity in the universe. In terms of the way we're describing it so far, some of that will be what we think of as the physical world, and some of it will be what we think as, our bodies and brains, but they're all, if you like, particular combinations of energy and information and so on. But as conscious beings, even though we doesn't look that way, we're still very much embedded in this sea of information and energy, which is kind of washing through us all the time, even though we only, pick up a certain number of things, and because our senses are only organized to attend to things which are useful to our biological survival and so on. But we're a product of it, and we remain embedded in it, and as part of it, we have the ability to, if you like, observe it. And so, in the broader sense, we are very particularized, concretized aspects of the universe, which have the ability to observe the universe. And in that sense, we participate in a process whereby the universe observes itself. And that's kind of, all the way from a very simple beginning to, if you like, the broad metaphysics at the end. But it takes me a whole book to do that. I've given it to you as a kind of thumbnail. Mm-hmm. But obviously, in order to justify that to my critical colleagues, which I enjoy doing, It takes me, well, for instance, in the version 2, in the second edition of my book, Understanding Consciousness, it takes me 14 chapters to get, all the way from the beginning to the end. But that's broadly the picture. Yeah. And within that picture, I can unpack all the other kind of questions that you might want to raise about different details and different questions you might want to ask about consciousness.
Right. So from that perspective, how would you approach the difference between, or the perceived difference between third person and first person consciousness?
Okay. And now that's really an important question.
Yeah.
And it really has to do with, to begin with, in a psychological sense, with the issue of what is the nature of mind. Now, let's do the same thing with mind that I've done with everything else so far, and to say, be theoretical just to begin with, and just list the kinds of way we can know what mind is like, or what processes of mind are like. And here we get a kind of basic fact of the matter, that if I was trying to understand your mind, investigating the processes, mental processes going on for you, I have to access those processes from an external perspective, an external third-person perspective. So the only way I can access your mental processes is by observing what I can observe of you, and if I go into that more deeply and start examining your brain, using all my sophisticated instruments, everything that I would describe as a mental process going on in you could be described from that perspective in terms of human information processing, if I'm a cognitive psychologist, for example, or in terms of neural activity. Neuroscience is more the area in which I want to work. So neurochemical interactions amongst complex processes in the brain. That's what mental processes just look at from a third-person perspective. But of course, we all know that there isn't anything going on. Something I can't actually observe from the outside is how you're experiencing these processes. So if I want to find out anything about that, then I really need to find out something about that, even to, if you like, find an anchor for what I'm observing, I have to ask you. So let's say you're having a visual experience and I'm looking at, events in the visual system. Unless you actually tell me you're having a visual experience, I won't know that the events I'm observing actually relate to a visual experience. So in this case, in order even to get the whole science going, you have to supplement the third-person observations with first-person observations. But no, what I've had to do also is to switch perspectives. I had to switch from my third-person perspective to your first-person perspective in order to get a picture of what's going on. Yeah?
Right.
Now you can get on to the business of saying, well, okay, but what's really going on? Basically, if you look from the outside, mental processes just look like neurochemical processes. But from a first-person perspective, in this case, your own, your mental processes really look like anything insofar as they manifest in your personal experiences. Are they more like thoughts, or are they more like history? And then the position I developed back in 1991, actually, I did a very detailed examination of these kinds of issues in a target article in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences, looking at, and the name of that target article was Is Human Information Processing Conscious? And basically there I introduced the idea that both of these views of the processes going on in your mind, for example, or my mind, for example, both ways of examining those processes provide some information which the other one doesn't. So from a third person perspective, you can learn certain kinds of things about these processes. For example, their embodiment in brain states. And from a first person perspective, you can learn other things about these processes. For example, their manifestation in terms of conscious experiences. And that actually, in order to understand the mind, or these mental processes in any full sense, you need both perspectives. Not only that, the perspectives are complementary, because one perspective will tell you information which the other perspective won't. And so eventually I came round to the view that the mind can be thought of as a form of information processing that manifests in these dual ways, and formally the term for this is a dual aspect theory of information processing. And one further element, it's insofar as you then want to say, yeah, but what? Still, I want to know what it really is. Okay, it's information processing. You must be processing in something. And then the move is to say, well, look, the closest we can get to what that something is to, if you like, combine the information we've got about it from both these perspectives. So one is, a psychological perspective, another one is a physical perspective. And so we add the word psychophysical to it. That's all I'm doing here, saying it's a psychophysical form of information processing that develops over time. And we have a complementary first and third person views of it, which are complementary and mutually irreducible.
Right.
So it's a dual aspect theory of information processing in which the aspects are complementary and mutually irreducible, and that's as far as I would want to go with that, just for the moment.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that since you're relying on for third-person consciousness, you're relying on observation, which, of course, as a scientist, you have to do anyway. This is your basis for testing hypotheses. And for first-person consciousness, you're relying on self-report. You're relying on how someone tells you that something is. That doesn't leave a lot of room for, say, Chalmers' philosophical zombies, because how would you judge someone or something to be a philosophical zombie or a p-zombie in the sense that they behave consciously, and even if they report, yes, I'm conscious, that you can still point to them and say, but you're not, or there's any reason to believe that you're not?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And actually, when Chalmers published his first main paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 1995, I was one of the commentators on it. I also published a paper because a lot of what he was saying was pretty close to what I was saying in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences Target article that I'd already published. But in this, I also introduced a possible route through that problem. And as it happens, it relates quite closely to what I understand some of your interests are, which is, I suggested a cortical implant for blind sight. Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Now,
okay.
Now here's the run of the argument. The problem with the philosophical zombie, just as you've described it, is that from the outside, you can't really tell, whether, that operation is or is not accompanied by consciousness in the zombie or the artificial system or whatever it is. And strictly speaking, the usual, only option which is considered is that you'd have to be that system or zombie in order to actually know you were conscious. But there is actually a third option, which is to in some way incorporate elements of such functioning into yourself. So I suggested, for example, that let's say we take something really simple, like our ability to discriminate two colors. Shall we say apple green from billiard table green? Yeah?
Okay.
Or just two colors. And this is purely hypothetical, and let's say we'd worked out exactly what the neural correlates were of observing color A versus observing color B, as well as, had tapped into the processes which supported the distinctive differences between those neural correlates. And let's say that we, had a full functional analysis of that triad, the supporting processes, and then the two, if you like, information patterns, and could emulate that, in a device, yeah. And then, this is really science fiction, I'm afraid, but at least it's a theoretically possible way of settling the question. Let's say now that one could switch between one's normally functioning brain, when presented with colors A and B, and the cortical implant. So you simply have a switch, yeah? Now, logically, there are three possible outcomes to that. One would be, when you switch into the implant, somebody who's having this done to them would say, hold on, I don't see anything. I can sense there's something different, but I can't detect any colors. But if you ask me, is A different to B, I could tell you. I could still respond, that's A and that's B. And that would make it like a cortical implant for blind sight, where in fact people can respond, to X's versus zeros, even though they visually don't experience them. That's why it's blind sight. That's just option one. Option two is they say to you as you switch, when are you going to switch?
Yeah.
In other words, they can't tell any difference. And in that case, you would say, well, the only thing that kind of matters, at least in an embodied human being, is whether the functioning is exactly the same, because you've replicated the functioning in your implant. And then the third option is they say, whoa, I'm having a really weird color experience here. I can't really describe it. I can tell that one is different to the other, but there just aren't any words in my language for it. And because, let's say, the implant is made of silicon as opposed to carbon. In that case, you would draw the conclusion that not just functioning matters, but also the system which embodies the functioning matters in terms of, the quality of the experience that you've had. And although I think that's complete sci-fi, at least in principle, you could answer the question that way.
Yeah. This is actually a way that I've sometimes thought about the concept of whole brain emulation or mind uploading, is that it provides an opportunity to make a lot of these very philosophical, difficult questions practical.
Yep.
In the sense that you can come up with experimental tests, just like the one that you just suggested. Yeah, that's interesting. So since we're sort of sliding into that topic anyway, and we're actually already over our time, I just wanted to see if you have a personal thought coming from the perspective of someone who's thought deeply about consciousness, about two of the very important things that would be involved if one were to be able to create a whole brain emulation into which, say, someone could upload, if we want to use that science fiction terminology for it, where one of the very important things would be able to create a device, a machine, some other substrate, or some place where you can reinstantiate a working brain that has all of the necessary cognitive functions and therefore exhibits consciousness, at least that you can observe from a third person. And the second very important thing, of course, would be, can you potentially survive this change, this transfer? Say you are living right now in your biological brain, and then you are, from that, creating and emulating something that is based on your brain structure, the content of your memory, and so forth. So really those two things are at the core of what, what our rather far-flung futuristic interest is about. And from a consciousness perspective, is there anything that you can say about that, where you say, well, this is something you really have to pay attention to because this is problematic? It's okay. If you don't have a personal opinion, you can also say pass.
I'm very tempted to pass, but I mean, there's such a range of deep issues there to do with personal identity. And on the one hand, of course, as you well know, there are all these practical issues, about how deeply. Let's kind of extending, for example, from the little, tiny experiment that I was describing before. There are already two possibilities here, or three. There are actually three possibilities here, just as there were in the cortical implant for blind sight experiment that I described. So if you simply produced a device that emulated the functioning, simply had it, that, nothing more, then whether the emulated functioning actually was accompanied by experience of any kind would depend a bit on the outcome of that tiny experiment. So in one case, two extremes, if you got the functioning exactly right, you could still either have no conscious experience, or you could have a completely emulated conscious experience. On the other hand, if you had a system that wasn't, constructed out of the material that the brain is constructed out of, it could be, shall we say, a silicon emulation of that original mind.
Yeah.
And then there completely, so that would be my answer to begin with. You've got three logical possibilities there. And in a way, the best way to answer that would be to go for something really tiny first, if you really were concerned about that, rather than go for the full thing. Because, as we both recognize, I think, that you could do the full emulation, which from the third person perspective would be, passing any Turing test you care to think of. But still have, scratching your heads about whether that was just a system that was functioning as you'd built it to function, as opposed to experiencing anything. Logically, that's got to be a possibility. The second one, we'd need a really long conversation for me to express what I think about this. But the whole business of sorry. What did you say?
This is because personal identity is such a thing.
Yeah, the whole personal identity thing, and there's a whole philosophy, I'm sure you must know about it, that recognizes the various scenarios and logical conundrums and so on. So we haven't got time to go into that,
no, we don't. No.
No, I don't want to confuse the whole issue by setting out on that path and not being able to finish, really.
That's totally fair. I've already realized that this topic keeps bumping into the personal identity topic, but that they really are too big, each of them, to handle them all at once. It can't be done that way.
Sure.
So, yeah, I think we can just leave it at this right now. But, so is there anything else that I have not touched upon that you think that the listeners should really know about, that you want to tell them?
Oh, yeah, I've got encyclopedias of stuff that...
maybe you want to point them somewhere and say, please read this.
Okay. For a start, I've got over 100 papers online, for example, on ResearchGate or Academia Edu. But if you want a quick review of the main things I've been talking about, all the way from defining consciousness to the reflexive model, but then far more detailed addressing of all the main questions to do with the nature of consciousness and its interaction with the brain and so on, ultimately arriving at something like reflexive monism, then the best place is really the second edition of Understanding Consciousness 2009. And that goes way, way, way beyond anything we could possibly discuss in just a few minutes.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'll make sure that there's a link to that as well.
Okay.
Thank you so very much for your time.
Okay,
I know
my
that
pleasure.
the connection has been a little